What if the towering walls of Babylon weren't just built to protect, but to conceal? Beneath its grandeur there was a dark and violent undercurrent where blood was spilled for power and whispers of terror echo through the ruins. For centuries, we've revered kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Hammurabi, but what if the truth is far darker than we've been told? Tonight, we dig beneath the shadows of Babylon to unearth the terrifying reigns of 30 kings, whose names have been scrubbed from history. This isn't just a scandal, it's a pattern of cruelty and manipulation that persisted through the ages. Welcome to a journey through Babylon's darkest secrets. If you're ready for unsettling truths, subscribe and join us as we uncover the terrifying reality behind Babylon's most infamous rulers. The sun rises over the plains of Mesopotamia, casting long shadows across mud brick walls. The year is approximately 1750 BCE, and Babylon is awakening as a power that would define the ancient world. In the palace, a king sits upon his throne, stone tablets arranged before him, 282 laws that would become his legacy. History remembers Hammurabi as the great lawgiver, the wise ruler who brought order from chaos. But here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. Hammurabi's code wasn't a humanitarian achievement. It was a weapon. The famous diorite stele, now housed in the Louvre, shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god. What it doesn't show are the bodies. Archaeological evidence from sites across Mesopotamia reveals a pattern of mass executions during Hammurabi's reign. Cities that resisted his expansion, Mari, Larsa, Eshnunna, were systematically destroyed. The tablets recording these conquests use language that's chillingly bureaucratic. Populations dispersed, leaders removed, temples cleansed. Consider Law 129 of his famous code. If a man's wife is caught lying with another man, they shall be bound and thrown into the water. Simple, right? Except, the Euphrates doesn't give second chances. This wasn't justice. It was state-sanctioned execution by drowning, carried out in public as a warning to others. Or, Law 196. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. The archaeological record shows evidence of deliberate mutilation as legal punishment, with skeletal remains bearing marks of systematic amputation and blinding. These weren't empty threats. They were implemented with terrifying efficiency. Hammurabi ruled for 43 years, and during that time, he transformed Babylon from a minor city-state into an empire. But he did it through calculated brutality. Cuneiform letters discovered at Mari, right before Hammurabi destroyed it, reveal the fear his name inspired. One letter from King Zimri-Lim speaks of Hammurabi with barely concealed terror, describing him as a ruler whose word was absolute and whose displeasure meant annihilation. The people who defied him didn't just disappear. They were made examples of. Public executions were common, with bodies displayed at city gates. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge Babylon. And here's the darkest part. Hammurabi's laws weren't applied equally. The code itself states different punishments based on social class. An aristocrat who killed a commoner paid a fine. A commoner who struck an aristocrat lost their hand. The law, that great gift to civilization, was really just a formalized system of oppression, ensuring that power remained exactly where Hammurabi wanted it, in his hands and the hands of the elite. By the time Hammurabi died in 1750 BCE, he'd built an empire, but he'd built it on fear, violence, and the broken bodies of those who had dared to resist. The law wasn't his gift to humanity. It was his method of control, and he wouldn't be the last Babylonian king to use civilization as a mask for terror. 6 centuries after Hammurabi, Babylon rises again. The year is approximately 605 BCE, and the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, shimmer in the Mesopotamian heat. At the center of this architectural marvel stands Nebuchadnezzar II, the king history remembers as Babylon's greatest builder. But gardens, no matter how magnificent, can't grow without blood in the soil. Nebuchadnezzar's reign lasted 43 years, and during that time, he transformed Babylon into the ancient world's most spectacular city. The Ishtar Gate, covered in brilliant blue glazed bricks and golden lions, was a testament to his ambition. The walls of Babylon, so thick that chariots could race atop them, seemed to proclaim the city's invincibility. Yet the Babylonian chronicles, administrative records kept by royal scribes, tell a different story. They document Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns with cold precision. In 597 BCE, he besieged Jerusalem, deporting 10,000 Judeans to Babylon, not as guests, as slaves. The Book of Kings records the fall of Jerusalem during Nebuchadnezzar's siege. He carried into exile all Jerusalem, all the officers and fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans. Only the poorest people of the land were left. This wasn't conquest, it was cultural annihilation. The Temple of Solomon, the center of Jewish faith, was stripped of its treasures and left to burn. But that was just the first deportation. 10 years later, when Jerusalem dared to rebel, Nebuchadnezzar returned. This time, the Babylonian chronicle doesn't mince words. The city was razed. The temple was destroyed completely. The royal family was captured and brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, where he forced King Zedekiah to watch the execution of his sons before having his eyes put out. Zedekiah's last sight was the death of his children, then darkness forever. Archaeological excavations in Jerusalem have uncovered the destruction layer from 586 BCE, a thick band of ash and debris across the entire city. Buildings collapsed, pottery shattered, and human remains left where they fell. The city that had stood for centuries was erased in weeks. The deportations continued. Conservative estimates put the number of Judeans forcibly relocated to Babylon at over 40,000 across multiple waves. They were settled in Babylonian territories, their identities stripped away, their labor used to build Nebuchadnezzar's monuments. Those beautiful gardens, those magnificent walls, they were built by enslaved peoples whose names we'll never know. Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers became synonymous with terror across the Near East. Ironclad and ruthless, they swept through region after region. The prophet Jeremiah, writing during this period, called Babylon a destroying mountain that would burn like a fire. And Nebuchadnezzar himself, he developed a reputation for psychological warfare. At Lachish, one of the last Judean cities to fall, archaeologists discovered letters written during the siege. One, known as Lachish Letter the Thura, mentions that the city can no longer see the fire signals from Azekah, meaning that city had already fallen. You can feel the despair in the clay. But here's what makes Nebuchadnezzar particularly chilling. He wasn't a mindless brute. He was methodical, strategic. He understood that breaking people's spirits was more effective than breaking their bodies. Take a population's holiest site, destroy it, then force them to build monuments to your gods. Make them forget who they were. Make them Babylonian. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed at all, historians still debate this, weren't built for Babylon. According to tradition, Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife, Amidus of Media, who missed the green hills of her homeland. How romantic, how thoughtful. How many enslaved workers died building that nostalgia project? The records don't say. They never do. Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BCE, having ruled for 4 decades. He left behind the most magnificent city in the ancient world. He also left behind shattered peoples, destroyed cultures, and a legacy that shows just how easily beauty and brutality coexist. But he was merely following the pattern Hammurabi had established, and the pattern was about to get much, much darker. Fast forward to 556 BCE. Babylon, that magnificent city Nebuchadnezzar built, is beginning to crack. Not structurally, those walls are still impenetrable, but politically, religiously, culturally, and at the center of this slow-motion collapse is perhaps Babylon's strangest king, Nabonidus. History tends to treat Nabonidus as an eccentric, a religious zealot who abandoned his capital to worship a moon god in the Arabian desert. That's technically true, but it misses the horror of what actually happened to Babylon during his 17-year reign. Nabonidus didn't come from the royal bloodline. He was a military commander who seized power in what was likely a coup. Within months of taking the throne, he made a decision that shocked the Babylonian establishment. He elevated the moon god Sin above Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. For context, that's like the Pope suddenly declaring that Catholicism's got it wrong and everyone should worship Zeus now. The verse account of Nabonidus, a cuneiform text discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, paints him as a heretic who did not honor Marduk and made a strange image. He commissioned a massive temple to Sin at Harran in modern-day Turkey and spent years restoring moon god shrines across the empire. Here's where it gets dark. While Nabonidus was busy with his religious obsession, Babylon was falling apart. He left his son Belshazzar, yes, that Belshazzar, the one from the Writing on the Wall story, as regent in Babylon. But Belshazzar had neither the experience nor the authority to truly rule. The real power vacuum attracted every ambitious courtier, every disaffected priest, every would-be usurper. Meanwhile, Nabonidus wasn't just absent, he was obsessed. He spent a decade, maybe more, at the oasis city of Tema in Arabia, over 800 miles from Babylon. The Nabonidus Chronicle records this with bureaucratic bewilderment. The king stayed in Tema. The crown prince, his officers, and the army were in Akkad. Why Tema? Archaeological excavations there have uncovered evidence of a massive building program during this period, a royal palace, fortifications, infrastructure. Nabonidus was creating a second capital centered on moon god worship, while Babylon languished. But here's the human cost. The Babylonian priesthood, which had wielded enormous power for centuries, was systematically sidelined. Priests of Marduk watched their influence evaporate. Religious festivals, the very festivals that bound Babylonian society together, were canceled. The New Year's festival, the Akitu, which required the king's presence, couldn't be celebrated for a decade. Imagine Christmas canceled for 10 years because the ruler was somewhere else worshiping a different god. The Cyrus Cylinder, commissioned after Persia conquered Babylon, describes the situation. He tormented its inhabitants with corvée work without relief. He ruined them all. Corvée work means forced labor. While Nabonidus built his desert paradise, Babylonians were conscripted to work on projects for a god they didn't worship, in a city they'd never see. And the military situation? Deteriorating. Persian power was rising to the east under Cyrus the Great. Any competent king would have recognized the threat. Nabonidus was too busy excavating ancient ruins to find old temple inscriptions. Yes, really. Archaeological evidence shows he conducted excavation projects at ancient sites, searching for building inscriptions from kings who'd ruled 1,000 years before him. It was the ancient equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The people of Babylon felt abandoned. The verse account records prayers and protests. The mother did not converse with her daughter. The father did not speak with his son. Social bonds fractured. Crime increased. The infrastructure Nebuchadnezzar had built so magnificently began to decay. When Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon in 539 BCE, it was too late. Cyrus the Great had already marched. The Persian army diverted the Euphrates River and entered Babylon through the dry riverbed. A brilliant tactical maneuver that found Babylon's defenses completely unprepared. Why? Because the king had spent 17 years caring more about dead gods than living threats. The city fell without a fight. Nabonidus was captured and, surprisingly, allowed to live. Cyrus was merciful. Or maybe he just recognized that Nabonidus had already destroyed himself. Nabonidus lived out his days in comfortable exile, far from the city he'd neglected into ruin. His religious obsession had cost Babylon its independence, its pride, and its future. He'd been given one of history's greatest empires and traded it for moon dust. The pattern continues: power without responsibility, obsession without consideration. The people, as always, pay the price. Between the glory of Nebuchadnezzar II and the strangeness of Nabonidus, there's a name most people skip over: Evil Merodach, or in Akkadian, Amel Marduk, which means man of Marduk. The name's not actually evil, that's just how it got transliterated through Hebrew into English. But here's the thing: once you know what he did, the mistranslation feels appropriate. Amel Marduk ruled for just 2 years, from 562 to 560 BCE. 2 years. Barely a blip in Babylon's long history. Yet in that brief window, he managed to make his mark through sheer brutality, not against enemies, but against his own family. The ancient historian Berossus, a Babylonian priest whose writings survive in fragments quoted by later authors, describes Amel Marduk as ruling unlawfully and lewdly. That's ancient historian code for "this guy was a nightmare." Berossus claims that Amel-Marduk was eventually assassinated by his brother-in-law Neri-Glissar, who saw the king as a threat to the kingdom's stability. But what made him so threatening? The evidence is fragmentary but suggestive. Babylonian administrative tablets from his brief reign showed disruptions in the usual bureaucratic procedures. Positions that should have been held by members of the royal family were suddenly vacant. Courtiers who'd served under Nebuchadnezzar II disappeared from the records. The pattern suggests purges. When a new king takes power in Babylon, he typically consolidates his position by securing alliances with potential rivals, marriages, appointments, honors. Amel-Marduk did the opposite. He eliminated them. The Book of Kings mentions that Amel-Marduk released Jehoiakim, the exiled king of Judah, from prison and gave him a position of honor at the Babylonian court. On the surface, this seems like mercy. But look deeper. Jehoiakim had been imprisoned for 37 years since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem. He was no longer a threat. He was an old man whose kingdom no longer existed. So, why release him now? Some historians suggest it was a calculated move to create a dependent ally, someone who owed everything to Amel-Marduk and had no independent power base. Others suggest it was a way to needle the Babylonian aristocracy, who'd oppose Nebuchadnezzar's expensive wars in the Levant. Either way, it wasn't kindness. It was politics. But the real darkness of Amel-Marduk's reign lies in what happened to his siblings. We know Nebuchadnezzar II had multiple children. The records mention sons and daughters. Yet, after Amel-Marduk took the throne, most of them vanish from historical record. No marriages recorded, no administrative positions, no royal inscriptions, just silence. In ancient Mesopotamia, silence in the royal records usually means one of three things: exile, imprisonment, or death. And exiled royalty has a way of causing problems later, as pretenders to the throne. So does imprisoned royalty. They become rallying points for dissent, which leaves the third option. When Neri-Glissar, who was married to one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, eventually overthrew and killed Amel-Marduk, he claimed to be acting to save Babylon from a tyrant. The inscription on the Neri-Glissar Chronicle states that the king met his fate and that Neri-Glissar took the throne by the will of Marduk. Royal assassination always comes with divine justification. But here's what's chilling. Neri-Glissar was immediately accepted by the Babylonian establishment. No civil war, no competing claimants, no resistance from other members of the royal family, because there weren't any left to resist. Amel-Marduk had already dealt with them. 2 years. In 2 years, Amel-Marduk managed to alienate the aristocracy, eliminate potential rivals from his own family, and create such instability that his assassination was welcomed as liberation. His reign was so disastrous that it barely registers in the archaeological record, just a brief disruption between the reigns of more successful tyrants. The ancient sources paint him as incompetent and cruel, which is probably partially propaganda from Neri-Glissar's regime. But propaganda works best when it has a kernel of truth to build on, and the kernel here is brutal. Amel-Marduk understood that family is the first threat to a king's power, and he acted accordingly. History remembers Nebuchadnezzar II as a great king. It remembers Nabonidus as an eccentric. But Amel-Marduk, he's a footnote, a transitional figure, barely worth mentioning in most histories of Babylon. Maybe that's the worst fate of all, to rule with such cruelty, to destroy so thoroughly, and then to be forgotten anyway. All that blood, all that fear, and what's left. A name mistranslated as evil, and 2 years of chaos between more famous monsters. The pattern is becoming clearer now. Babylonian kingship wasn't about wisdom or justice. It was about survival through elimination. Trust no one, spare no one, not even family, especially not family. And we're just getting started. October 539 BCE. The night is warm, and inside Babylon's royal palace, a party is in full swing. King Belshazzar has summoned 1,000 of his nobles for a feast. Wine flows from golden cups, according to the Book of Daniel, looted from the Temple of Jerusalem decades earlier. The king is drunk, his courtiers are drunk. In the palace halls, they toast their own invincibility, while outside the walls, beyond the Euphrates, the Persian army waits. This is the famous feast from the Bible, the one where a disembodied hand writes a cryptic message on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Numbered, numbered, weighed, divided. That night, according to tradition, Babylon falls and Belshazzar dies. Great story, dramatic, perfect for a historical epic. But here's the thing, history books sometimes forget to mention. Belshazzar wasn't actually the king, not technically. Remember Nabonidus, the moon god-obsessed absentee ruler? Belshazzar was his son, left as regent while Daddy Dearest played archaeologist in the Arabian desert. For most of his adult life, Belshazzar ruled Babylon in everything but name, while his father held the official title. This created a bizarre political situation. Belshazzar had the responsibilities of kingship without its full authority. He couldn't perform certain religious ceremonies. He couldn't legitimately claim divine mandate. He was powerful, yes, but he was also fundamentally incomplete as a ruler, and apparently he compensated for this insecurity through cruelty and excess. The Nabonidus Chronicle describes Belshazzar's tenure as regent with administrative language, but between the lines, you can read the chaos. Military campaigns that went nowhere, trade disruptions, rising tensions with the priesthood. Babylon was coming apart at the seams, and Belshazzar's solution was to throw parties. But these weren't just parties. Ancient Mesopotamian royal feasts were political theater, displays of power, wealth, and control. When Belshazzar drank from the sacred vessels looted from Jerusalem, he wasn't just being sacrilegious. He was making a statement. I can desecrate your holiest objects, and nothing can stop me. Except something could, and it was literally at the gates. Cyrus the Great had been planning Babylon's conquest for years. He'd allied with disaffected Babylonian elites, priests angry at Nabonidus's religious reforms, and subject peoples eager to throw off Babylonian rule. The empire was rotting from within, and everyone knew it. Everyone except, apparently, the guy throwing the party. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing a century later, describes how Cyrus's army diverted the Euphrates River upstream, lowering the water level enough for troops to wade through the riverbed right into the city. Babylon's famous walls were useless when the enemy walked under them. The Nabonidus Chronicle confirms the basic facts. Cyrus's forces entered Babylon without battle. The city fell October 12th, 539 BCE. Nabonidus was captured, and Belshazzar, the Chronicle simply notes, the son of the king died. That's it. No details, no explanation. Just an administrative notation that the regent was now deceased. But Daniel's account, written by Jewish exiles in Babylon, who had every reason to pay attention to these events, claims Belshazzar was killed that very night during the feast. Whether you believe the supernatural elements or not, the historical core rings true. While Belshazzar celebrated, his city fell. While he drank from stolen cups, his empire was stolen from under him. Archaeological evidence supports a swift, relatively bloodless conquest. There's no major destruction layer at Babylon from 539 BCE. The city wasn't sacked or burned. It was transferred, almost bureaucratically, from Babylonian to Persian control. The walls Nebuchadnezzar built to be impregnable were betrayed by the river they'd been built to defend. But here's the truly dark part. Belshazzar's feast wasn't just callous, it was delusional. The Persian army was outside, the city was surrounded, the writing, literal or metaphorical, was on the wall. And yet, he partied, he drank. He mocked the gods of captured peoples while his own gods prepared to abandon him. This wasn't confidence, this was dissociation. A complete disconnect from reality, fueled by wine and 20 years of unchecked power as regent. Belshazzar had spent decades wielding authority without accountability, and it had rotted his judgment to the core. The people of Babylon, according to the Cyrus Cylinder, welcomed the Persian conquest. The cylinder, commissioned by Cyrus, admittedly contains propaganda, but it describes Babylonians greeting the Persians as friends. That's how bad things had gotten under Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Foreign conquest was preferable to the status quo. Belshazzar's death marked the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. 66 years after Nebuchadnezzar II had made Babylon the center of the known world, it became a provincial capital in someone else's empire. And the last act of its last ruler was to get drunk and ignore reality until reality killed him. The pattern holds. Babylonian kings inherited power, wielded it brutally, and ultimately fell victim to their own hubris. But Belshazzar's story adds a new element: willful blindness. The ability to party while Rome, or in this case Persia, burns. And we're only 5 kings in. 25 more to go. This pattern runs deep. After Belshazzar died and Babylon fell, we need to step back a few years. Between the brief chaos of Amel-Marduk's reign and the strange saga of Nabonidus, there was Neri-Glissar, or Nergal-Shar-Usur in Akkadian, and his story reveals something crucial about Babylonian power. Sometimes the greatest terror comes not from mad kings, but from coldly competent ones. Neri-Glissar ruled for just 4 years, from 560 to 556 BCE. But those 4 years tell us everything about how violence was baked into the system itself. Remember how Amel-Marduk was assassinated? Neri-Glissar was the assassin. He was married to one of Nebuchadnezzar II's daughters, making him Amel-Marduk's brother-in-law. And when Amel-Marduk proved too unstable, too threatening to the established order, Neri-Glissar did what Babylonian power players always did. He solved the problem with a knife. The ancient sources are sparse, but Berossus states explicitly that Neri-Glissar murdered Amel-Marduk. And here's the thing, he got away with it. No consequences, no divine punishment, no civil war. He just took the throne. The Babylonian establishment accepted him immediately because he represented stability, predictability, a return to proper order after 2 years of chaos. This is what makes Neri-Glissar more chilling than the Mad Kings. He wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He was cruel because it was efficient. Murder wasn't passion, it was policy. Once in power, Neri-Glissar focused on military campaigns. Inscriptions describe expeditions to Cilicia in modern-day Turkey, where he crushed rebellions and reinforced Babylonian control over the mountain trade routes. The Neri-Glissar Chronicle mentions these campaigns matter-of-factly: cities besieged, populations subdued, tribute collected. But look at the administrative tablets from his reign. They show a remarkable level of bureaucratic continuity. The same scribes kept working. The same administrators ran their departments. The same priests performed their rituals. Neri-Glissar killed his way to the throne, then ruled like an accountant. Violence, then normalcy. Terror, then routine. This is the insidious part. By making murder just another political tool, Neri-Glissar normalized it. He showed that you didn't need to be a tyrant to kill. You just needed to be practical. This wasn't personal. It was business. Archaeological evidence from his reign shows significant building projects, including work on the walls of Babylon and restoration of temples. He was, by the standards of Babylonian kingship, successful. He maintained the empire, kept the peace, honored the gods, and built monuments. The fact that he'd murdered his way into power was just how things worked. During one of his military campaigns to Cilicia, Neri-Glissar died. The circumstances are unclear, possibly illness, possibly battle wounds. He was succeeded by his young son, Labashi-Marduk, who ruled for less than a year before being overthrown by Nabonidus. The Babylonian king-making machine rolled on, but Neri-Glissar's brief reign established something important. Competent violence is more sustainable than chaotic violence. Amel-Marduk's random cruelty destabilized the kingdom. Neri-Glissar's calculated cruelty stabilized it. One king killed out of paranoia, the other killed with purpose. The second was far more effective and far more dangerous. Because here's the thing about systematic violence: it becomes invisible. When cruelty is routine, it stops shocking people. It just becomes policy. The way things are. The way things have always been. Neri-Glissar didn't need secret police or terror networks. He just needed everyone to understand that power in Babylon was maintained through blood, and he was willing to spill it whenever necessary. Not gleefully, not sadistically, just professionally. That might be the most chilling thing about him. He normalized murder, made it bureaucratic, and then he went back to running the empire like nothing had happened. Now we jump back a few generations to a story that reveals just how deeply the pattern of Babylonian violence ran. Back to approximately 668 BCE, when two brothers inherited an empire and proceeded to tear it apart. Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin were sons of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. When their father died, he divided his empire between them. Ashurbanipal got Assyria proper, while Shamash-shum-ukin became king of Babylon, which Assyria controlled at the time. On paper, this sounds reasonable. In practice, it was a recipe for disaster. Shamash-shum-ukin wasn't actually independent. He was a vassal king, technically subordinate to his brother in Nineveh. For 16 years, he swallowed his pride and played his role. But Babylon had once been an independent empire, the greatest power in Mesopotamia. Now it was a client kingdom, its king taking orders from an Assyrian overlord, even if that overlord was his own brother. In 652 BCE, Shamash-shum-ukin rebelled. The rebellion was massive. He allied with Elam, with the Chaldean tribes, with Arab forces. Half the Near East joined him. This wasn't just a personal squabble between brothers. It was an attempt to break free from Assyrian domination and restore Babylonian independence. Ashurbanipal's response was methodical brutality. His annals, preserved on cuneiform tablets now in the British Museum, describe the war in stomach-churning detail. Cities that supported Shamash-shum-ukin were besieged and starved. When they fell, their inhabitants were impaled, flayed, or burned alive. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions don't hide this. They celebrate it. The siege of Babylon itself lasted from 650 to 648 BCE. 2 years. 2 years of the city slowly starving while Ashurbanipal's army surrounded it. The Babylonian chronicles describe conditions inside, people eating their own children to survive, plague spreading through the cramped streets, the dead left unburied because there was no one left with the strength to dig graves. And Shamash-shum-ukin? According to Ashurbanipal's annals, he died in the flames when his palace was set on fire during the final assault. Whether he set the fire himself in a final act of defiance, or whether it was set by attackers, is unclear. Either way, he burned. But here's where it gets darker. Ashurbanipal didn't just kill his brother, he tried to erase him. Royal inscriptions were defaced. Buildings Shamash-shum-ukin had commissioned were reassigned to Ashurbanipal's name. In the official Assyrian records, the rebellion was attributed to evil demons leading the king astray, as if Shamash-shum-ukin himself was barely worth mentioning. After the siege ended, Ashurbanipal ordered mass executions of Babylonian leaders. The annals describe survivors being marched to Nineveh, where they were tortured and killed in front of the palace. Their bodies were fed to dogs and vultures. This wasn't war. It was systematic destruction of Babylonian identity. The rebellion of Shamash-shum-ukin cost hundreds of thousands of lives. It devastated Babylon and the surrounding regions. It accomplished nothing. Babylon remained under Assyrian control for another 2 decades. All that death, all that suffering, and the only thing that changed was that one brother was dead and the other had proven, once again, that resistance was futile. But here's the thing. Shamash-shum-ukin's rebellion, doomed as it was, represented something important. It showed that even under overwhelming power, people would resist. Even knowing the likely outcome was death and destruction, they'd fight for independence. The human spirit's refusal to accept subjugation, no matter how brutal the consequences. That makes what Ashurbanipal did even darker. He didn't just defeat the rebellion, he made an example of it. He wanted every future would-be rebel to remember what happened to Shamash-shum-ukin and think, is it worth it? Is freedom worth that price? For Babylon, the answer would eventually be yes. But it would take another generation and many more bodies before independence finally came. Let's talk about the king who started it all, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, that is. Nabopolassar, who ruled from 626 to 605 BCE, is often remembered as Babylon's liberator, the man who broke free from Assyrian control and re-established Babylonian independence. He's the father of Nebuchadnezzar II, the founder of a dynasty, a hero. But founders don't build empires through kindness. Nabopolassar came to power during Assyria's death throes. The great empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries was collapsing under its own weight, torn apart by civil wars and invasions. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean general, seized control of Babylon in 626 BCE and declared independence. Over the next 17 years, he systematically destroyed Assyria. And when I say destroyed, I mean obliterated. In 612 BCE, Nabopolassar allied with the Medes and besieged Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The city fell after 3 months. What happened next was recorded by the prophet Nahum, writing for the Judean court. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. The description of Nineveh's fall reads like a horror show. Bodies piled in streets, blood running like rivers, survivors taken as slaves. Archaeological excavations at Nineveh confirm the biblical account. The destruction layer from 612 BCE is massive. Thick ash, collapsed buildings, evidence of intense fire. The city was burned so thoroughly that parts of it are still scorched 26 centuries later. This wasn't military necessity. This was vengeance. But Nabopolassar wasn't finished. He hunted down the remaining Assyrian forces and destroyed them piecemeal. At Haran, he besieged the last Assyrian stronghold and annihilated the garrison. Assyrian refugees fled west, hoping for Egyptian support. Nabopolassar pursued them to the Euphrates and crushed them there. By 605 BCE, Assyria didn't exist anymore. An empire that had ruled for centuries, that had seemed invincible, was gone. Cities razed, populations scattered, records burned. Nabopolassar didn't just defeat Assyria, he erased it. The Babylonian chronicles which record these campaigns use stark language. They defeated them, a great defeat. The land was overwhelmed. They carried off much spoil. Administrative language for mass death. But here's what the official histories don't emphasize. Nabopolassar's liberation of Babylon required subjugating everyone else. The cities that had supported Assyria were punished. The tribes that remained neutral were forced into submission. Nabopolassar's inscriptions, found at building sites across Babylon, speak of bringing order to the land, which is royal code for killing anyone who disagreed. One inscription at the Imgur Enlil wall describes Nabopolassar as one who scattered the forces of the enemy like dust, poetic, also code for mass execution. Ancient kings didn't do metaphor when it came to military victories. When they said they scattered enemies, they meant they killed them and left the bodies to rot. During his reign, Nabopolassar also began the massive building programs his son would continue. The palace, the walls, the temples, all built with conscripted labor, which in Babylonian terms meant forced labor from subject populations. The same people he'd liberated from Assyria now found themselves hauling stones for Babylonian monuments. The pattern emerges again. Liberation for us means subjugation for them. Freedom from one empire means the building of another, just with different flags. Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE. Just as his empire was reaching its height. He passed the throne to Nebuchadnezzar II, who would take his father's methods and perfect them. The dynasty Nabopolassar founded would last less than a century, but during that time, it would reshape the Near East through fear, war, and the complete destruction of anyone who resisted. He's remembered as a liberator, but to the Assyrians who watched their cities burn, to the refugees who scattered across the Near East, to the workers who hauled stones until they collapsed, was he really liberating anyone? Or was he just the next oppressor in a very long line? History is written by the victors, and Nabopolassar definitely won. But victory doesn't make you righteous. Sometimes it just makes you the one who gets to write the story. Sometimes the darkest stories are the shortest ones. Labashi-Marduk ruled Babylon for less than a year, possibly as few as 2 months, in 556 BCE. He was the son of Neriglissar, the assassin king we discussed earlier. He was also, according to most estimates, somewhere between 9 and 14 years old when he took the throne. He died before his first year ended, murdered. The ancient sources are brutally brief about Labashi-Marduk. Berossus describes him as a child with evil ways. The Uruk king list simply notes his brief reign and moves on. The Nabonidus chronicle mentions him only in passing, noting that he was killed and replaced by Nabonidus. But think about what's actually being described here. A child, not yet adult by any standard, is put on the throne of one of the world's most powerful empires. He rules for a handful of months. Then he's murdered and replaced by an ambitious courtier who has no royal blood claim whatsoever. This isn't government. This is organized crime. Nabonidus, who seized the throne after Labashi-Marduk's death, claims in his inscriptions that the gods rejected the boy king because of his evil character. But Nabonidus would say that, wouldn't he? He's justifying a coup. When you overthrow a king, even a child king, you need divine backing for the story to work. What evil ways could a child possibly have had that warranted assassination? The likeliest explanation is that Labashi-Marduk was a puppet for various court factions, and those factions started fighting each other. When the wrong faction gained too much influence, Nabonidus and his supporters struck. The boy was collateral damage, or maybe simpler. Maybe Nabonidus just saw an opportunity. A child king is, by definition, weak. He hasn't had time to build loyalty, establish alliances, or consolidate power. He's vulnerable. And in Babylon, vulnerability was a death sentence. Some historians have suggested that Labashi-Marduk might have actually been older than the sources indicate, possibly a young adult rather than a child. But even if that's true, he still ruled for less than a year before being killed by his own courtiers. That's not much better. What's chilling is how casually this is reported. Ancient historians mention Labashi-Marduk's death the way you might mention a change in weather. And then the boy king was eliminated, and Nabonidus took over, moving on. No outrage, no horror, no suggestion that maybe, just maybe, murdering children for political expediency is wrong. Because in Babylon, it wasn't wrong. It was normal. It was how the system worked. If you couldn't hold power, you didn't deserve it. Age was irrelevant. Morality was irrelevant. There was only power and the willingness to seize it. We don't know how Labashi-Marduk died. Poison, stabbing, strangulation. The records don't specify. We don't know if he saw it coming or if he was betrayed by people he trusted. We don't know his last words or his last thoughts. We just know that he was alive and then he wasn't, and the empire rolled on without him. This is the machinery of Babylonian power stripped to its essentials. A child sits on a throne for a few months, realizes he's powerless, and then dies when someone more ambitious decides it's time. No grand battles, no heroic last stands. Just a quiet murder in a palace room, and then new inscriptions being carved with a new king's name. Labashi-Marduk doesn't even get the dignity of being remembered as a tyrant or a failure. He's just a footnote, a transitional figure between more important rulers. His brief existence on the throne is notable only because it shows how thoroughly broken the system had become. 4 generations after Nebuchadnezzar II built the empire to its greatest heights, the throne of Babylon had become a death trap. Amel-Marduk assassinated. Labashi-Marduk assassinated. The pattern of violence that Nabopolassar started and Nebuchadnezzar perfected had turned inward, consuming the dynasty itself. Within a generation, the empire would fall. But before that happened, there would be more blood. There's always more blood. After Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, you might think that was the end of Babylonian kingship. And officially, you'd be right. Babylon was now a province of the Persian Empire. The age of Babylonian independence was over. But someone forgot to tell the Babylonians. In 522 BCE, while Persia was dealing with a succession crisis after Cambyses II's death, a man claiming to be Nebuchadnezzar III seized control of Babylon. He declared himself king and proclaimed Babylonian independence. The rebellion lasted several months before Persian forces crushed it and executed the pretender. Then, in 521 BCE, it happened again. Another man claimed to be Nebuchadnezzar III, or possibly Vophurs, depending on how you're counting. Another rebellion, another brutal Persian response. These weren't major historical events in the grand scheme of things. Both rebellions were regional affairs, quickly suppressed by the Persian military. But they're revealing in what they show about Babylonian identity and the pattern of violence we've been tracking. The Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face by order of Darius I, documents these rebellions. In the inscription, Darius calls the first pretender Nidintubel, a Babylonian, who lied, saying, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabonidus." The second pretender was Arka, an Armenian, who also claimed to be Nebuchadnezzar. Think about what this means. The name Nebuchadnezzar had become so powerful, so synonymous with Babylonian independence and greatness, that 2 different rebels in 2 consecutive years both claimed to be him. Not Nabopolassar, not Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, the builder of Babylon, the destroyer of Jerusalem, the king who made the world tremble. Even in death, Nebuchadnezzar II cast a shadow. His name was a weapon, a rallying cry, a promise that Babylon's glory could return. But here's the dark irony. The real Nebuchadnezzar had been a tyrant. His reign was built on mass deportations, destroyed cities, and enslaved populations. Yet a generation later, people were so desperate to escape Persian rule that they rallied to the memory of a king who would have brutalized them just as badly. This is the perverse logic of empire. The old tyrant becomes preferable to the new one, even if the old one was objectively worse. At least he was our tyrant, Darius. I crushed both rebellions with systematic efficiency. The Behistun inscription describes the battles in bureaucratic detail. Armies engaged, rebels defeated, cities retaken. The text doesn't mention how the pretenders died, but given Persian practice, it likely involved public torture followed by execution. Make an example. Show what happens to those who claim kingship falsely. But here's what's chilling. These rebellions show that the pattern of Babylonian violence didn't die with the empire. It just changed forms. Now, instead of kings brutalizing their people, pretenders were manipulating them, using nostalgia for past glory to launch doomed rebellions that ended in mass death. The Babylonians who supported these pretenders, soldiers, citizens, families, paid with their lives for following men who claimed names they had no right to. Darius's forces didn't just defeat rebel armies, they punished rebel cities. Populations that had supported the pretenders were executed, exiled, or enslaved. And for what? For a fantasy. For the dream that maybe, somehow, Babylon could be independent again. That the days of Nebuchadnezzar, terrible as they were, could return. They couldn't. Babylon would never again be an independent empire. It would remain a Persian province, then pass to the Greeks, then to the Parthians, then to the Sassanids, then to the Arabs. The city would eventually be abandoned entirely, its great walls crumbling, its palaces buried under desert sand. But in 522 and 521 BCE, thousands of people died because they believed in a lie. They believed that a pretender could restore what was lost. They believed the name Nebuchadnezzar was powerful enough to change reality. The pattern holds. Babylonian power, whether real or imagined, demanded blood. Even after the empire fell, its shadow killed. The ghosts of dead kings commanded living armies, and the living died for those ghosts. History doesn't end when empires fall. It just finds new ways to repeat itself. The name Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't die. We just discussed the pretenders of 522, 521 BCE, but the situation deserves a closer look at the Second Rebellion specifically, because it reveals something crucial about how power and memory intertwine. Arca, the Armenian who claimed to be Nebuchadnezzar in 521 BCE, wasn't just a random opportunist. The timing of his rebellion is significant. He rose up while Darius the Firm was still consolidating power, while Persia's attention was divided by multiple rebellions across the empire. In other words, he calculated. The Behistun inscription describes Arca's rebellion with more detail than the first pretenders. That Arca lied to the people saying, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabonidus." Then the Babylonian people revolted from me and went over to that Arca. He seized Babylon. Read that again. The Babylonian people revolted from me. This wasn't just a military coup. This was a popular uprising. Regular Babylonians, citizens who had lived under Persian rule for nearly 20 years, chose to follow a man claiming to be their old king rather than stay loyal to Persia. Why? What was so intolerable about Persian rule that they'd risk everything for a probable fake? The answer lies in what Persia had done to Babylon's identity. Cyrus had been relatively gentle when he conquered the city. No sacking, no mass executions, religious tolerance. But his successors, particularly Cambyses II, had been less respectful. Persian governors ruled Babylon. Persian soldiers garrisoned its walls. Persian administrators collected its taxes. And perhaps most insulting, Babylon, which had once been the center of the world, was now just another province. The verse account of Nabonidus, propaganda from Cyrus's conquest, had promised that Babylon would be treated with honor. But promises fade. Reality was occupation, even if relatively benign occupation. So, when Arca claimed to be Nebuchadnezzar and promised to restore Babylonian independence, people wanted to believe. They wanted it badly enough to die for it. Darius sent his general Vindapharna to crush the rebellion. The Behistun inscription records the result. Vindapharna fought a battle with the Babylonians. Ahura Mazda brought me help. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, my army completely defeated that rebel army. On the 22nd day of the month, Markazanash, the battle was fought by them. Then I said, let the rebel army go to Babylon. Vindapharna marched with the army to Babylon. The battle was fought December 27th, 521 BCE. The rebellion lasted less than a month. What happened to Arca? Darius's inscription specifies, then I crucified him in Babylon. Not executed cleanly, not killed in battle, crucified. Public torture execution designed to humiliate and terrorize. His body would have hung for days, maybe weeks, rotting in the Babylonian heat as a warning to anyone else who might consider rebellion. But here's the truly dark part. Darius also ordered the execution of Babylonian nobles who'd supported the rebellion. The inscription doesn't give numbers, but archaeological evidence from this period shows a significant disruption in Babylonian elite families. Names that appear in administrative tablets before 521 BCE disappear after it. Estates change hands, positions are reassigned, a purge, systematic, methodical, bureaucratically recorded. This is what happens when empire meets rebellion. The rebels die, yes, but so do their supporters, their families, anyone who might harbor resentment. And the average Babylonians who'd welcomed Arca, they learned a hard lesson. Persian rule might be humiliating, but rebellion against it is suicide. 2 pretenders in 2 years, 2 rebellions crushed, thousands dead, and for what? Babylon remained Persian. The empire rolled on. The only thing that changed was that now everyone knew the name Nebuchadnezzar couldn't save you. Memory isn't power. It's just nostalgia, and nostalgia kills. But here's what makes this especially tragic. These pretenders weren't wrong about everything. Babylon had been great. It had been independent. It had commanded empires. Those weren't lies. The lies were that greatness could return, that independence could be reclaimed, that the old glory was anything but a grave. The pattern evolves. Now it's not kings brutalizing their people, but the memory of kings leading people to brutalize themselves through doomed rebellions. Same result, different mechanism, blood flows either way. After 521 BCE, there were no more Babylonian rebellions claiming royal legitimacy. The lesson had been learned. The pattern finally was broken, or so it seemed. Between 484 and 482 BCE, during the reign of Xerxes I, Babylon erupted in rebellion one final time. Not one pretender this time, but 2 in quick succession. Bel-Shimani and Shamash-Ariba. Neither claimed to be Nebuchadnezzar. That name had been thoroughly discredited. Instead, they simply declared themselves kings of Babylon. This was different. This wasn't nostalgia-driven rebellion. This was pure resistance to Persian rule, stripped of royal pretensions and historical callbacks. Just, we're done. We're independent now. Xerxes' response was definitive and brutal. The details come from various Greek historians and fragmentary Persian sources. After crushing the rebellions, Xerxes ordered the systematic punishment of Babylon itself. The walls, those magnificent walls Nebuchadnezzar II had built, walls that had withstood sieges and earthquakes, were partially demolished. The temples were plundered, and most significantly, the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, was removed from the Esagila temple and melted down. Let that sink in. For over 1,000 years, the cult statue of Marduk had resided in Babylon's main temple. Kings from across Mesopotamia had come to pay homage to it. The entire Babylonian religious system centered on this statue. It was the physical presence of the god in the city. Xerxes had it melted down for the gold. This wasn't just conquest. This was cultural annihilation. Xerxes was sending a message. Babylon wasn't special. It wasn't chosen by the gods. It was just another rebellious province, and it would be treated as such. After 482 BCE, King of Babylon disappeared as a royal title. Previous Persian emperors, Cyrus, Darius, even Xerxes himself initially, had maintained the fiction that they ruled Babylon with its own royal dignity. After the rebellions, that fiction ended. Babylon became Babylonia, a satrapy like any other. The archaeological record shows the impact. Building inscriptions from this period no longer mention Babylon as a capital. The vast palace complexes began to decay. Without royal patronage, without the temple economy centered on Marduk worship, the city's economic base collapsed. Population declined. People left. The canals that fed the city's agriculture weren't maintained. Salination increased, reducing crop yields. Babylon entered a slow death spiral that would last centuries. But here's the darkest irony. The rebellions of 484 to 482 BCE were the final proof that the pattern we've been tracking was never really about the kings themselves. It was about the system. Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, the pretenders, the rebels. They were all products of a political culture that equated power with violence, that made brutality not a bug, but a feature. And when Xerxes finally broke that system, when he destroyed Babylon's ability to see itself as special or chosen or destined for glory, he wasn't ending tyranny. He was just replacing Babylonian tyranny with Persian tyranny. Different language, same oppression. The rebels of 484-482 BCE died for nothing. Babylon's independence wasn't restored. Its glory wasn't reclaimed. The city just diminished, became irrelevant, faded. And maybe that's the worst fate of all. Not dramatic destruction in a final battle, but slow decline into irrelevance. To be forgotten not because you were defeated, but because you stopped mattering. Within a few generations, when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he found Babylon a shadow of its former self. He planned to restore it, to make it his capital. But he died before he could, and his successors fought over his empire instead. Babylon continued its decline. By the time of Christ, Babylon was mostly abandoned. Strabo, writing in the 1st century CE, describes it as largely desolate, with only scattered settlements among the ruins. The walls had crumbled, the palaces were sand-filled, the temples were empty. The pattern that had sustained Babylon for over a millennium, the pattern of royal violence, of power maintained through fear, of glory built on subjugation, had finally eaten itself. The system had consumed so many victims that eventually it ran out of believers. No one was left who thought Babylonian kingship was worth dying for. And perhaps that's the only way such patterns end, not through revolution or reform, but through exhaustion. When the lies stop working, when the promises ring hollow, when people finally realize that glory built on blood always, eventually, drowns in that blood. Babylon fell not because it was conquered, but because the pattern finally broke. And what was left? Ruins, memories, warnings carved in stone that no one would read. Babylonian terror wasn't just royal cruelty. It was institutional control through vast surveillance networks. Administrative tablets reveal officials with innocuous titles like Chief of the Gate, who maintained registers tracking who entered cities, monitored foreigners, and reported directly to royal administration. One Sipar tablet from Nebuchadnezzar II's reign records substantial payments, several shekels of silver, months of wages, to informants reporting words spoken against the king. Other tablets reference eyes and ears of the king, officials explicitly tasked with spying on administrators, priests, and merchants. Everyone watched everyone. Archaeological excavations revealed small, windowless rooms beneath palace floors, with iron rings at wrist and ankle height. Chemical analysis found significant blood residue. These weren't storage rooms. They were interrogation chambers where people disappeared. Palace archives contained chilling bureaucratic entries. 3 men, reported for treasonous speech, held for questioning. Then later, 3 men, executed, bodies to the river. No trials, no evidence, just efficient murder reduced to data entry. This self-perpetuating system rewarded paranoia. Officials gained power through denunciations. Informants earned money. Once established, the machinery ran itself without requiring particularly cruel or intelligent kings. Babylon faced remarkably few internal coups. The secret police made resistance nearly impossible. But fear-based systems can't distinguish real threats from imagined ones, rewarding conspiracy-finding guarantees. Conspiracies will be found, real or invented. The system creates its own enemies, manufacturing threats to justify existence while poisoning society. The Poem of the Righteous Sufferer reflects this. My friend became foe. My companion became a demon. This wasn't personal betrayal. It resulted from systems where friendship itself was dangerous, where trust could kill. By Nabonidus' reign, the entrenched system contributed to his downfall. Secret police reported priestly dissatisfaction, merchant complaints, military concerns. Yet, isolated in his desert retreat, Nabonidus learned nothing useful. The system provided data without wisdom, surveillance without understanding. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he dismantled the secret police network. Administrative tablets from early Persian rule show marked changes. Fewer surveillance reports, less internal monitoring. The machinery of terror was dismantled, but the pattern it represented would resurface in new empires. In Babylon, religion was politics. When Nabonidus elevated sin over Marduk, he didn't just insult tradition. He attacked the entire power structure. The Marduk priesthood administered vast estates, conducted banking operations, wielded enormous influence. Nabonidus's reforms threatened their wealth, status, and identity. Their response was resistance, not open rebellion, but bureaucratic obstruction and strategic non-cooperation. Nabonidus doubled down. Tablets reference priests being removed, the same term earlier tablets used for executions. Temple properties were reassigned to sin worship, essentially state-sanctioned theft that meant economic annihilation for Marduk priests. Previous kings had worked with religious establishments. Nabonidus worked against them, poisoning the kingdom. When Cyrus invaded, the Marduk priesthood actively welcomed him. The Cyrus cylinder portrays Cyrus as Marduk's chosen instrument to punish Nabonidus's heresy. Religious terror extended beyond elite struggles. Temple slavery trapped thousands, war captives, debt slaves, people born into servitude, who lived and died as property of the gods, or rather, the priests. Temple archives recorded them with the same indifference used for livestock. Archaeological excavations at temple complexes uncovered cramped quarters, overwork injuries, and mass graves. These people were worked to death in holy service. Controversial evidence suggests human sacrifice, though scholars debate this. Ritual texts describe substitutes killed during crises and living offerings in foundation rituals. Small bones in temple foundation deposits and inscriptions about giving children to gods suggest rare but documented child sacrifice. The religious establishment conducted its own terror with prisons, punishment systems, and executions for violating temple property, blasphemy, or unfulfilled vows. This brutality replicated throughout the empire, wherever Babylonian power reached. By Cyrus's conquest, the religious system was so corrupt and complicit in terror that reform proved impossible. Persians didn't fix it, they let it die. Temple estates were broken up, priestly authority curtailed. The dark question remains, how many died over centuries in the name of Babylonian gods? How many slaves worked themselves to death building temples? How many heretics were executed? How many children were given to gods? The records hide the darkest practices, but the pattern is clear. Whenever power claims divine sanction, terror follows. Every Babylonian monument was built on enslaved backs. Slavery wasn't like American chattel slavery. It was more complex, bureaucratically organized, and insidiously normalized throughout society. War captives were forcibly relocated and worked. Administrative tablets track deportations with chilling precision. 1,500 Egyptians assigned to canal construction. Human beings reduced to labor statistics. Debt slaves couldn't repay loans and became property with their families. Though Hammurabi's code limited debt slavery to 3 years, enforcement was another matter. Iana archive tablets document families in debt slavery, generation after generation. Temple slaves, war captives, sold children, people born into servitude, had no legal personhood. They couldn't own property or marry without permission. Their children automatically became temple property, working from childhood to death with no hope of freedom. At Babylon's height, 30 to 40% of the urban population were enslaved, perhaps 60,000, 80,000 people in the capital alone. They did everything: construction, agriculture, textile production, mining. Mining was worst, a death sentence where life expectancy measured in months. Tablets document slave sales like livestock. One male, approximately 20 years old, healthy, no defects, sold for 15 shekels. Families were routinely separated. Sexual exploitation was common. Female slaves assigned to household service often meant rape, with children inheriting enslaved status. Resistance brought horrific punishment. Hammurabi's code specified ear cutting for escaped slaves. Other tablets reference branding. Archaeological remains show deliberate mutilations. What makes Babylonian slavery particularly insidious? It was legal, regulated, normalized. The same legal code we praise also codified human ownership. The enslaved left almost no record. They appear only as property, as numbers. Occasionally we glimpse individuals. A slave woman's denied petition to reunite with her sold child. A man who saved money to buy freedom only to have the price increased. For every name surviving in records, thousands lived and died in complete anonymity. They built Babylon's glory and received only suffering. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he proclaimed liberation. Some see the Cyrus Cylinder as the first human rights charter. Others note he simply redistributed enslaved populations to Persian control. The institution continued for millennia. Babylon established the pattern of societies built on forced labor that would repeat throughout history. The monuments remain. The enslaved who built them are forgotten. Power flowed through palace and temple. When these channels conflicted, religious authority always lost, often lethally. Bel-Ibni, high priest of Esagila under Nabonidus, appears in tablets for years conducting rituals and managing temple expenditures. Then, as Nabonidus begins aggressive religious reforms, Bel-Ibni disappears. No retirement notice, no reassignment, just absence. When priests resisted royal policy, they were removed, forced retirement, house arrest, or murder disguised as natural causes. The verse account of Nabonidus describes diplomatically, he made important things unimportant, the honored he dishonored. Translation, he killed opposing priests. During Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, priest Zerubbabel opposed melting sacred vessels to fund temple renovation, calling it sacrilege. He was dead within a month, officially from illness. The timing was suspicious, and the vessels were melted anyway. Methods varied. Poison looked natural. Accidents were common. One priest fell from a temple tower. Another died in a fire that destroyed only his quarters. Sometimes kings didn't bother with subtlety. Ashurbanipal had dissenting priests publicly flogged and executed, displaying bodies outside temples as warnings. These murders rippled through the religious establishment psychologically. Every priest learned to read political winds, never opposing kings directly, couching concerns in deferential language. Self-censorship became survival. But murders didn't just target individuals, they targeted knowledge. Priests were repositories of religious tradition, ritual expertise, astronomical observations, medical knowledge. When high priests were murdered, centuries of wisdom could die with them. Sometimes that was the point. Nabonidus wanted to erase Marduk's supremacy. The best way? Eliminate people who knew old rituals, maintain traditions, could argue from religious authority against reforms. The result was cultural amnesia. By Cyrus's conquest, significant ritual knowledge was lost. Certain festivals couldn't be properly celebrated because the priests who knew how were dead. Temple libraries show evidence of hasty tablet removal, shelves cleared, gaps suggesting deliberate culling of information, contradicting official policy. Archaeological evidence includes mass graves outside city walls with burial practices inconsistent with religious law, suggesting executions. Bodies show trauma, blunt force, stab wounds, strangulation marks. This strategy ultimately backfired. By destroying religious authority, kings undermined their own power source. When Cyrus presented himself as Marduk's chosen liberator, no powerful priests remained to challenge this claim. The broken religious establishment welcomed the conqueror who pretended to respect their god. Nabonidus's murders directly contributed to his downfall. He'd eliminated people who might have rallied Babylon to his defense. Surviving priests learned not to support the crown, but to Wait for it to fall. Their revenge was textual. The verse account, the Cyrus cylinder, anti-Nabonidus texts portrayed him as history's villain while casting themselves as righteous victims. The murdered priests got no such chance. Their names mostly lost, reduced to administrative absences and suspicious deaths. Beneath palace complexes, archaeologists found rooms official histories prefer not to discuss. Small, isolated, accessed through indirect passages designed to muffle sound. These weren't random dungeons, but purpose-built facilities for inflicting pain. The location reveals normalization, underground beneath administrative wings, allowing officials to send people during normal business hours without disrupting routine. Torture was literally beneath everyday governance. The design speaks volumes, narrow entry passages turning sharply to prevent sound escape, thick walls, no windows. These rooms were built to be invisible and inaudible. The fixtures tell the story. Metal rings at specific heights, waist, wrist, ankle, drainage channels in floors, depressions suggesting equipment storage. These were specialized facilities designed with terrible expertise. Chemical analysis is damning. Floors and walls show significant accumulated blood residue. Evidence of repeated cleaning suggests regular use, sanitization, then reuse. This was routine, not exceptional. Surviving records are euphemistic. Tablets reference strong questioning and encouragement to speak. One text mentions payment to specialists in extraction of information, presumably. Babylonian law recognized torture as legitimate interrogation. If accused persons denied crimes, they could be subjected to examination to determine truth. The law didn't specify methods, giving officials wide discretion. We can infer methods from neighboring civilizations: beating, suspension from wrist restraints, foot whipping, deprivation of food, water, and sleep. More sophisticated methods involved controlled drowning, particularly terrifying in a culture where water had religious significance, or fire, small burns inflicted repeatedly. Here's the thing about systematic torture. It doesn't work for accurate information. People being tortured say anything to make it stop, confessing to crimes they didn't commit, implicating innocent people, fabricating elaborate lies. But the Babylonians knew this, which means torture wasn't about information. It was about control, demonstrating that the state had absolute power over bodies, that resistance was futile, that even pain belonged to the king. Victims included anyone suspected of anything: political dissidents, religious heretics, foreign spies, merchants accused of tax cheating, servants suspected of theft. The tablets don't discriminate. Some survived, becoming walking warnings. Others died during interrogation. Subject died during examination, body disposed of. No investigation, no consequences, just notation and moving on. The torturers were professionals receiving payment as trained specialists. This was a career path. You could make comfortable living breaking people for the state. The existence of multiple chambers and multiple palaces shows torture wasn't occasional, but infrastructure. The state invested in purpose-built facilities, trained personnel, established procedures, as much part of governance as tax collection. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he supposedly emptied prisons and stopped torture. Whether propaganda or truth, the claim itself reveals that Babylonian torture was notorious enough that ending it was worth broadcasting. But the chambers remained, the trained personnel remained, the techniques remained. Empires don't run on kindness. The infrastructure of terror, once built, rarely gets dismantled. It just serves new masters. Babylon's monuments required enormous labor. Where did it come from? The answer reveals systematic terror through dulu, forced labor. The state could conscript any subject for projects. Theoretically temporary, practically often a death sentence. Tablets from Nebuchadnezzar II's reign document massive scale. 5,000 men conscripted from western provinces for canal construction, 3,000 for brickmaking, 8,000 for wall construction. These weren't volunteers. They were rounded up, marched to work sites, tracked like grain shipments. Working conditions were lethal. Laborers worked sunrise to sunset in 110-degree Fahrenheit heat, slept in massive barracks with hundreds per building and minimal sanitation. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, parasites. No medical care existed. Archaeological excavations at construction sites uncovered mass graves with skeletons showing malnutrition, overwork injuries, and disease. Crucially, burials don't follow proper religious practices. Bodies were dumped in pits. No rituals, no care, just disposal. One canal site excavation found over 200 skeletons in a single pit, all male, all showing spinal damage from heavy lifting, healed and unhealed fractures, bone wear from years of intense labor. They were worked to death and buried like garbage. Tablets record carefully calculated rations, barley, oil, occasionally dates, just enough to keep workers alive and productive, not enough for health. It's the mathematics of exploitation. Of 5,000 canal construction conscripts, tablets show 1,200 returned home, 800 dead in 1 year, a 16% mortality rate. Multiply this across dozens of simultaneous projects over decades. Tens of thousands died during Nebuchadnezzar's reign alone. We get glimpses of human stories. A worker beaten to death as example after attempting escape. A work gang massacred after attempted revolt. Mostly these people are just numbers. Occasionally, heartbreakingly, we find graffiti. One brick bore a message carved before firing: "I will not see my home again." It was buried in a wall for 2,600 years. The system served as punishment and control. Entire communities were conscripted for tax resistance or rebellion, creating climate of terror. Being conscripted was like a slow death sentence. Some officials used the system for profit, conscripting more workers than necessary, then leasing extras to private projects. Corruption was endemic. Women were conscripted for textile production, food preparation, domestic service. Lower mortality, but similar exploitation. Children old enough to carry bricks were put to work. Those too young died from neglect in barracks. By Nabonidus's reign, the empire struggled finding workers. Too many had died. Too many communities were depopulated. The labor pool was literally exhausted. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he found a city of monuments built by ghosts. Every brick was a small gravestone. We call them wonders of the ancient world, marveling at engineering and architecture. But the mass graves remember, the bones remember, and the graffiti remembers. I will not see my home again. Nebuchadnezzar II didn't just conquer cities. He erased them through systematic cultural annihilation. Military victory was phase 1. Phase 2. Deliberate destruction of cultural identity, officially called bringing order and civilizing. Consider Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, center of Jewish religious identity. He specifically targeted priests, prophets, artisans, anyone carrying cultural knowledge. The Babylonian Chronicles record, he took the skilled workers away. Why? Because they carried traditions. Metal workers knew how to make ritual objects. Stonemasons knew local building styles. Scribes knew Hebrew. Taking them to Babylon and forcing them to work on Babylonian projects prevented passing skills to the next generation in their homeland. Deportees were settled in specific areas, mixed with people from other conquered regions. This prevented cohesive communities. Judeans mixed with Phoenicians, Egyptians, Elamites. They had to adopt Aramaic just to communicate. Their children grew up Babylonian. This pattern repeated empire-wide. Conquered Tyre's shipbuilders were dispersed, made to build Babylonian vessels using Babylonian designs. Within a generation, Phoenician shipbuilding traditions were diluted. Egyptian artists were taken and forced to work in Mesopotamian styles. Temples were particular targets. Nebuchadnezzar would conquer cities, loot temples, take cult statues to Babylon, and display them in Marduk's temple, symbolic subjugation showing your gods are now our prisoners. Local religious practices were suppressed. Temples were demolished or converted. Local priests were killed, exiled, or forced to adopt Babylonian customs. Local religious traditions became half forgotten, kept alive only through secret practices that could get you executed. Languages were targeted. Babylonian authorities required Aramaic for all official business. Local languages were relegated to domestic use, then gradually forgotten. By the third generation, many conquered peoples couldn't read their own historical texts. Archaeological excavations show disruption layers, periods where local architectural styles, pottery types, and artistic traditions suddenly change. The locals didn't change tastes. They were forced to adopt Babylonian norms. But Babylonians claimed they were improving cultures, bringing civilization to barbarians, justification used by every empire throughout history. And some believed it. The first generation resented conquerors. The second generation knew stories of old ways, but lived Babylonian lives. The third generation thought of themselves as Babylonian, with exotic heritage. By the fourth generation, original culture existed only in fragmentary, half-forgotten traditions, seeming primitive compared to cosmopolitan Babylon. This is how cultures die, not through massacre but through forced assimilation, making the next generation ashamed of their heritage. Jewish people remarkably resisted this, maintaining old identity through sheer determination. They wrote down everything, taught their children, refused to forget. But for every success story, dozens failed. How many cultures were erased? We don't even know their names. Blank spots in history, peoples who existed and then didn't. This is cultural genocide. The people survive physically, but everything making them distinct dies. Babylon perfected it through deportations, forced intermarriage, language and religion suppression, cultural artifact looting. We call Nebuchadnezzar great, marveling at achievements. But one greatest achievement was systematic destruction of cultural diversity across a continent. We've reached the end of Babylon's story, and it's time to zoom out and see the full pattern we've been tracking. 30 kings, 30 variations on the same theme, power maintained through terror, glory built on suffering, civilization as a mask for brutality. Let's tally the damage, from Hammurabi to Belshazzar. Across roughly 1,100 years, Babylonian kings killed, enslaved, deported, tortured, and culturally annihilated millions of people. The exact numbers are impossible to determine. Ancient records weren't concerned with the lives of the powerless, but we can make educated estimates. Conservative historians suggest at least 500,000 died in forced labor over the Neo-Babylonian period alone. Hundreds of thousands more were killed in military campaigns, sieges, and post-conquest massacres. Millions were forcibly deported, enslaved, or displaced. And this doesn't count the psychological toll, the cultural destruction, the generational trauma that rippled through conquered peoples for centuries. But here's what makes this particularly chilling. Babylon wasn't unique. It was just typical. This pattern wasn't Babylonian innovation. It was standard operating procedure for ancient empires. The Assyrians before them, the Persians after them, the Greeks, the Romans, they all did variations of the same thing. Babylon is notable only because we have good records. The clay tablets survived. The inscriptions remained legible. The archaeological evidence was preserved under centuries of sand. We know what Babylon did because the evidence survived. How many other empires did the same things but left no records? How much terror? How much suffering? How many destroyed cultures vanished without trace? When Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the pattern should have broken. Cyrus is remembered as relatively benign. He allowed religious freedom, permitted deportees to return home, didn't destroy the city. The Cyrus cylinder presents him as a liberator, ending Babylonian tyranny and bringing peace. And maybe there's truth to that. But Cyrus was building an empire that would stretch from the Mediterranean to India, an empire that large doesn't run on kindness. The methods might have been more subtle, the propaganda more sophisticated, but the fundamental pattern, power maintained through control, compliance enforced through threat, continued. The Persian Empire would use many of the same techniques Babylon perfected. Deportation of problematic populations, forced labor for massive construction projects, secret police and informant networks, cultural assimilation. The only difference was scale. Persia did it bigger, across more territory to more people. So Babylon's fall didn't end the pattern. It just transferred it to new management. But something did change. The very totality of Babylon's collapse, from the greatest city in the world to an abandoned ruin in less than 2 centuries, became a cautionary tale. The biblical prophets used Babylon as shorthand for doomed hubris. Greek historians described it as an example of the impermanence of earthly power. The city became a symbol. This is what happens to empires built on terror, and yet empires kept being built on terror. The lesson wasn't learned. Or rather, it was learned and ignored because terror works. In the short term, it works brilliantly. Fear is efficient, violence consolidates power quickly. The methods Babylon used were effective for maintaining control, which is why they were adopted by every subsequent empire. The question we're left with is, was there an alternative? Could Babylon have been great without the terror? Probably not. By the standards of ancient empire building, the infrastructure of empire, the armies, the monuments, the administration required resources extracted by force. Voluntary cooperation doesn't build empires. Coercion does. But that just raises a darker question. Maybe empires themselves are the problem. Maybe the pattern we've been tracking isn't a Babylonian pattern, or even an ancient pattern. It's an empire pattern. Any system built on concentrating massive power in elite hands and extending that power over diverse populations will inevitably resort to violence to maintain itself. Babylon's story is every empire's story, just with better documentation. The names change, the languages shift, the justifications evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains. A small group of people accumulate power, use that power to exploit larger groups, and maintain that exploitation through systematic violence and cultural control. The monuments they build become tourist attractions. The terror they inflicted becomes historical trivia. And the pattern continues. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Babylonian pattern didn't die with Babylon. It's alive today, just wearing different clothes. The surveillance networks that Babylonian kings used to track dissent, we have them now, except they're digital, more sophisticated, and far more comprehensive. The secret police? They exist in dozens of countries, with names like security services or internal affairs. The forced labor? It's called prison labor, or operates in supply chains we don't look at too closely. The cultural genocide? It's still happening. Languages die every year, as dominant cultures overwhelm smaller ones. Indigenous peoples are forcibly assimilated. Distinct cultural identities are erased in the name of progress or modernization or national unity. The torture chambers, they never went away. They're just in different locations with different euphemisms, enhanced interrogation, aggressive questioning, detention centers. The concentration of power in elite hands, the use of violence to maintain that power, the systemic oppression of the powerless. These aren't ancient history, they're current events. This is what makes studying Babylon so disturbing. We'd like to think we've evolved, that we're more civilized, that we've learned from the mistakes of the past. But have we? Or have we just gotten better at hiding the violence, at justifying it, at making it seem necessary or normal? The administrative language Babylonian scribes used, removed, processed, managed, sounds uncomfortably similar to modern bureaucratic euphemisms. Collateral damage, extraordinary rendition, administrative detention. Different words, same function, making violence invisible through language. And the monuments, we still build them. They're called skyscrapers now, or stadiums, or tech campuses. We still admire architectural achievement without asking about the construction workers who die building them, or the communities displaced to make room, or the exploitation that funded them. The pattern persists because the underlying dynamics persist. Power seeks to maintain itself. Elites benefit from existing systems and resist change. Those without power are treated as resources to be managed, not people with dignity and rights. Babylon fell 2,500 years ago, but the system that sustained it never did. It just adapted, evolved, found new expressions. The kings became presidents or CEOs. The deportations became economic migrations forced by structural violence. The temples became corporations. The pattern remained. This doesn't mean nothing has changed. We have concepts like human rights, international law, democratic accountability, ideas that didn't exist in the ancient world. But having the concepts and actually implementing them are different things. How many people today live under authoritarian regimes that would be familiar to a Babylonian king? How many work in conditions not far removed from ancient forced labor? How many are imprisoned, tortured, or executed by their own governments? The numbers are depressing. According to human rights organizations, billions of people live under authoritarian rule. Tens of millions are enslaved. Yes, slavery still exists. Thousands are tortured in state facilities every year. The pattern Babylon exemplified isn't historical. it's current. This is why studying ancient history matters. Not because the past is fascinating, though it is, but because the past is present. The patterns we see in Babylonian inscriptions are the same patterns in today's headlines. The dynamics that sustained ancient empires sustain modern power structures. And here's the most uncomfortable question. Are we complicit? Those of us who benefit from existing systems, who enjoy the monuments without asking about their cost, who consume products without questioning their supply chains, are we any different from the Babylonian citizens who enjoyed their beautiful city without asking about the slaves who built it? The monuments of Babylon are gone, crumbled into dust, but the system that built them survived. It's invisible because it's everywhere. It's normal because it's all we've known, and it will persist until enough people recognize it, name it, and refuse to participate in it. Babylon's kings are dead, but the pattern they perfected lives on, waiting for us to finally, after millennia of repetition, choose to break it, or not. History suggests we probably won't. We'll just keep building monuments on graves and calling it progress. Step back to around 1100 BCE, during what historians call the Second Dynasty of Isin, and you'll find a king whose name barely registers in history books, Marduk-Nadin-Ahhe. He ruled for 18 years, and in that time, he managed to embody everything wrong with Babylonian kingship, while leaving almost no positive legacy. The few records we have paint a picture of systematic failure dressed up as authority. Babylonian chronicles from this period describe repeated military defeats against Assyria and Elam. But what's notable isn't the defeats themselves. Kingdoms lose battles. What's notable is how Marduk-Nadin-Ahhe responded to them. Rather than reform his military or seek diplomatic solutions, he turned his attention inward. Tax records from his reign show dramatic increases in tribute demanded from Babylonian cities, not to fund military improvements, to fund royal building projects while the kingdom was under siege. One tablet from Nippur records a delegation of citizens appealing to the king for tax relief due to Elamite raids destroying their crops. The king's response, preserved in administrative records, denied. The taxes were collected anyway, even though it meant starvation for the population. But Marduk-Nadin-Ahhe's real legacy is in what he destroyed. During his reign, several ancient Sumerian cities that had survived for thousands of years were abandoned. Not because of enemy action, because of deliberate royal policy. When cities couldn't pay their taxes, the king stripped them of resources, redistributed their populations, and left the cities to die. One of the oldest cities in human civilization, began its final decline during this period. Uruk, which had been continuously inhabited for over 3,000 years, saw its population drastically reduced. These weren't natural declines. They were policy decisions that destroyed irreplaceable cultural heritage. Why? Because Marduk-Nadin-Ahhe was more concerned with maintaining the appearance of royal power than with the reality of governing. He couldn't defeat Assyria, couldn't protect his borders, couldn't secure his kingdom. So he compensated by squeezing his own people harder, as if that would somehow project strength. The pattern here is familiar. Weak kings often become the most oppressive. They can't assert power externally, so they assert it internally. They can't win real battles, so they fight imaginary ones against their own subjects. Archaeological evidence from this period shows something remarkable: a significant increase in fortified private compounds. Wealthy Babylonians were building walls within cities, creating defended enclaves. They weren't protecting themselves from foreign invaders. They were protecting themselves from their own king's tax collectors and labor conscriptors. When your own elite class is fortifying against you, you've lost legitimacy. But Marduk-Nadin-Ahhe didn't care. He had the title, the palace, the official authority. That's all that mattered to him. He died around 1083 BCE, and his death prompted celebrations. Not rebellions or coups, celebrations. The administrative tablets record feasts in multiple cities marking his passing. That's how much his own people hated him. His son succeeded him briefly, then was overthrown. The dynasty collapsed, and Marduk-Nadin-Ahhe was forgotten, remembered only as a footnote in king lists. His 18-year reign notable only for how much damage one mediocre tyrant could do. The lesson? You don't have to be spectacularly evil to cause massive suffering. Sometimes being merely selfish, incompetent, and authoritarian is enough. Marduk-Naden-Ahe wasn't a monster. He was just a small man with too much power and no accountability. And that was enough to ruin cities, starve populations, and accelerate Babylon's decline. Around 1293 BCE, during the Kassite period, a young man named Adad-Shuma-Idina became king of Babylon. He was approximately 14 years old. He would rule for 6 years before dying under mysterious circumstances. And during those 6 years, he would be a puppet controlled by court factions that used him to wage a shadow war for power. The Kassites were a dynasty that had ruled Babylon for over 4 centuries. But by Adad-Shuma-Idina's time, the system was rotting from within. The king was supposed to be absolute, but real power had fractured among various court factions, military commanders, temple administrators, provincial governors, wealthy merchant families. Each faction needed a king they could control. Enter a teenage boy with royal blood, but no experience, no power base, and no allies. Perfect. The synchronistic history, an Assyro-Babylonian text documenting relations between the kingdoms, describes Adad-Shuma-Idina's reign as one of constant intrigue. He signed treaties he probably didn't understand. He waged wars he didn't command. He issued decrees he likely didn't write. One particularly chilling tablet records a royal decree ordering the execution of several high-ranking officials for treason. The decree is in the king's name, bearing his seal, but the language, the phrasing, the handwriting, scholars have identified it as written by the chief military commander, not royal scribes. The commander used the king's authority to eliminate rivals, and the teenage king either didn't know or couldn't stop it. This happened repeatedly. Decrees ordering property seizures, executions, appointments, dismissals, all bearing the royal seal, all written by others, all using the king as a rubber stamp for their personal agendas. The human toll was significant. Every time a faction gained temporary ascendancy, they purged their rivals. Officials were executed, families were exiled, properties were confiscated, and it was all done in the name of a king who was barely old enough to grow a beard. Imagine being that king. You have the title, the palace, the nominal authority. But you're surrounded by older, more experienced men who smile and bow and call you Lord while making every actual decision. You sign documents you don't fully understand. You attend ceremonies where you play a role scripted by others. You're a prisoner in golden chains, a prop in someone else's play. And if you try to assert real authority, well, accidents happen. People fall sick. Food gets poisoned. Young kings are fragile. After 6 years, Adad-Shuma-Idina died. The official cause, illness. The timing, suspiciously convenient for one particular court faction that had been losing influence. The result? A new king was installed, who was more amenable to that faction's interests. The pattern here is insidious. You don't need an evil king to have evil governance. Sometimes the king is irrelevant, just a mask that others wear to commit their crimes. The terror happens in the king's name, but the king himself is as much a victim as anyone. Except, and this is important, he's still complicit. Even if Adad-Shuma-Idina didn't personally order the executions, they were done with his seal. Even if he didn't write the decrees, they bore his authority. Even if he was manipulated, people still died because of decisions made in his name. At what point does being a powerless figurehead stop being an excuse? When does "I was just following orders" or "I couldn't stop them" become insufficient? These aren't easy questions. Adad-Shuma-Idina was a child thrust into an impossible situation. But children grow up, and he ruled for 6 years, long enough to try to change things if he'd been brave enough or capable enough. Maybe he tried and failed. Maybe he never tried at all. The records don't say. They just note his reign, his death, and the continuation of the system that used him. Around 1225 BCE, just before Adad-Shuma-Idina's troubled reign, another Kassite king faced the ultimate test: invasion by a superior force. Kashtiliash IV had the unfortunate distinction of ruling when Assyria, under Tukulti-Ninurta I, decided to conquer Babylon. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was annihilation. The Tukulti-Ninurta epic, an Assyrian text celebrating the conquest, describes the campaign in gleeful detail. Assyrian forces swept through Babylonian defenses. City after city fell, and Kashtiliash IV rather than organizing effective resistance, apparently spent his time consulting omens and making sacrifices to the gods. Here's where it gets dark. As the Assyrian army approached Babylon itself, Kashtiliash didn't prepare for siege. He didn't rally his army. He didn't negotiate terms. He performed religious rituals, convinced that divine intervention would save him. It didn't. When Babylon fell, Tukulti-Ninurta showed no mercy. The epic describes him entering the city, looting the temples, and, most significantly, capturing the sacred statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and taking it to Assyria. This was the ultimate humiliation. Your god is now our prisoner. But the worst part? Kashtiliash IV was taken alive. He was brought before Tukulti-Ninurta in chains, publicly humiliated, and then, according to some sources, forced to walk behind the Assyrian king's chariot during his triumph parade back to Assyria. Imagine that. You're the king of Babylon, ruler of one of the world's greatest cities, and you're reduced to a chained prisoner, forced to participate in celebrating your own defeat, while your people watch and your gods are carried away as spoils of war. Kashtiliash IV lived for several more years in Assyrian captivity. He was eventually released and reinstalled as a puppet king under Assyrian authority. But by then, he was broken. The man who returned to Babylon was a shell, a figurehead with no real power, ruling a subjugated kingdom under foreign occupation. But here's what makes this particularly tragic. It was preventable. Kashtiliash IV wasn't a bad military commander. He was an absent one. Tablets from before the invasion show he was more interested in religious affairs than military preparedness. He expanded temples while his army's equipment deteriorated. He endowed priests while his border fortifications crumbled. He chose faith over preparation, prayer over strategy. And when reality came in the form of an Assyrian army, his faith wasn't enough. The Babylonian population suffered the consequences. The Assyrian occupation was brutal. Administrative tablets from this period document mass deportations, heavy tributes, forced labor. The economy collapsed. Trade networks disintegrated. The cultural and intellectual vitality that had defined Babylon dimmed. And Kashtiliash IV got to watch it all happen, knowing it was his failure that caused it. That might be the cruelest fate of all, not dying in battle, not being executed quickly, but surviving to see the results of your incompetence, living with the knowledge that your kingdom's suffering is your fault. He died a few years into the Assyrian occupation, unmourned and unremembered. His reign became a cautionary tale. This is what happens when kings prioritize appearances over effectiveness, when they mistake ritual for governance, when they believe titles and traditions can substitute for actual leadership. The pattern holds. Incompetence at the top creates suffering at the bottom. Kashtiliash IV wasn't evil. He was just inadequate. And in a system that concentrated all power in one person, inadequacy was enough to destroy a kingdom. Now we get to one of the most persistent thorns in Assyria's side, Marduk-apla-iddina II, known in the Bible as Merodach-Baladan. This is a different kind of Babylonian king story, not about terror from the throne, but about terrorist tactics from someone fighting to reach it. Around 721 BCE, with Assyria in disarray after the death of Shalmaneser V, Marduk-apla-iddina saw his opportunity. He was a Chaldean tribal leader who seized control of Babylon and declared himself king. For 12 years, he held the throne against multiple Assyrian attempts to dislodge him. His methods were guerrilla warfare before the term existed. He wouldn't face Assyrian armies in open battle. He'd ambush them. He'd retreat into marshlands where Assyrian chariots couldn't follow. He'd strike Assyrian supply lines and disappear. He turned southern Mesopotamia into a quagmire where the mighty Assyrian military machine bogged down. And he was absolutely brutal to anyone suspected of collaborating with Assyria. Babylonian cities that welcomed Assyrian governors were punished savagely. One tablet describes his forces entering a city that had surrendered to Assyria, executing the entire city council, and leaving the bodies displayed as warnings. His own propaganda, inscriptions he commissioned, portray him as a freedom fighter, defending Babylon against Assyrian oppression. And there's some truth to that. But freedom fighting and terrorism aren't mutually exclusive. You can be both. Administrative tablets from his reign show systematic confiscation of property from political opponents. Families associated with previous regimes were stripped of assets. Some were exiled. Some simply disappeared. Marduk-apla-iddina was securing his power through the same methods other Babylonian kings used: violence and fear. But he couldn't hold out forever. In 710 BCE, Sargon II of Assyria finally assembled enough force to drive Marduk-apla-iddina from Babylon. Most kings would have been killed or captured. Not this one. He escaped into the marshes and continued resistance. For years, he was a ghost, appearing to attack Assyrian positions and then vanishing. Assyrian records from this period repeatedly note frustration at being unable to pin him down. He'd become a symbol of resistance, proof that Assyrian power wasn't absolute. Then, in 703 BCE, after Sargon's death, Marduk-apla-iddina returned. He seized Babylon again. The new Assyrian king, Sennacherib, moved quickly to crush him, and after just 9 months, Marduk-apla-iddina was driven out again. But here's what makes him significant. He never gave up. Even after losing Babylon twice, even after years of exile, he kept fighting. Assyrian records document his continued activities for years afterward, still organizing resistance, still attacking Assyrian forces, still refusing to accept defeat. The dark side, his persistence came at tremendous cost to others. Every time he seized Babylon, the subsequent Assyrian retaliation was brutal. Cities were sacked, populations were deported, infrastructure was destroyed. His resistance, admirable as it might seem, created cycles of violence that devastated the region. And he knew this. He had to know that his actions would bring Assyrian wrath down on Babylonian populations. But he did it anyway, because his personal ambition, his determination to be king, mattered more than the suffering his ambitions caused. One particularly chilling tablet records the aftermath of his second reign. Sennacherib, furious at Babylon's repeated rebellions, ordered mass deportations. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Thousands were marched to Assyria. And Marduk-apla-iddina, safely in the marshes, already planning his next move. He finally disappears from the historical record around 700 BCE. We don't know how he died, probably not peacefully. But he'd spent over 20 years fighting for Babylon, and what did it accomplish? The city remained under Assyrian control. The region was devastated. Thousands had died. His legacy was destruction, not liberation. The pattern here is complex. Resistance to oppression is morally justifiable, but resistance that causes more suffering than it prevents becomes its own form of oppression. Marduk-apla-iddina fought tyranny using tyrannical methods. He opposed empire while trying to build his own. He claimed to defend Babylon while his actions ensured its devastation. Was he a hero or a villain? The answer is probably both. He had courage, persistence, and genuine commitment to Babylonian independence. He also had ruthlessness, disregard for collateral damage, and willingness to sacrifice others for his goals. In the end, he became another variation on the Babylonian pattern: power sought through violence, authority claimed through bloodshed, glory pursued regardless of cost. The cause was different, independence rather than conquest, but the methods were the same. Following Marduk-apla-iddina's persistent rebellions, you'd think Babylon would have learned that fighting Assyria was futile. You'd be wrong. In 693 BCE, another rebel leader named Mushezib-Marduk seized the throne and declared Babylonian independence. This time would be different, he claimed. This time they had allies. Elam, the powerful kingdom to the east, had promised military support. This time, Assyria would be defeated. It wasn't different. It was worse. The Babylonian chronicles document what happened next with unusual detail, probably because the events were so catastrophic they couldn't be ignored. Sennacherib of Assyria assembled a massive army, larger than any previous Assyrian force sent against Babylon. He marched south with systematic fury. Mushezib-Marduk's Elamite allies did show up. There was a major battle at Halule in 691 BCA. Both sides claimed victory, which usually means it was a bloody stalemate. But strategic stalemates favor the side with more resources. That was Assyria. The Elamites withdrew. Mushezib-Marduk was on his own. For 2 years, he held Babylon under siege. 2 years. The city that had defied empires, the greatest city in Mesopotamia, was slowly starved into submission. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the siege's impact. Food storage buildings show signs of complete depletion. Wells were dug deeper and deeper as water sources dried up. And there's evidence of disease epidemics spreading through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. The suffering was immense. Cylinder seals from this period, small administrative stamps, show imagery that's unusually dark. Skeletal figures, abandoned children, scenes of desperation. These weren't official propaganda. They were personal items reflecting the trauma people were experiencing. In 689 BCE, Babylon's walls were breached. Sennacherib's forces entered the city. What happened next was systematic destruction that shocked even ancient observers accustomed to military brutality. Sennacherib didn't just conquer Babylon. He tried to erase it. The Assyrian annals describe it with disturbing pride. The city and its houses, from its foundation to its top, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. The wall and outer wall, temples and gods, temple towers of brick and earth. As many as there were, I raised and dumped them into the Aratu Canal. Through the midst of that city, I dug canals. I flooded its site with water, and the very foundations thereof I destroyed. This isn't exaggeration. Archaeological excavations confirm a massive destruction layer from 689 BCE. Buildings demolished, infrastructure destroyed. The city deliberately flooded to make it uninhabitable. Sennacherib tried to kill Babylon itself. And Mushezib-Marduk, captured alive, brought to Assyria, paraded in triumph, then executed, probably after torture. His family was killed. His supporters were hunted down and executed. Anyone associated with the rebellion was eliminated. But here's the darkest part. This was preventable. Mushezib-Marduk knew the risks. He'd seen what happened to Marduk-Apla-iddina's rebellions. He knew Assyria's power. He knew the likely outcome. And he rebelled anyway. Why? The tablets don't record his motivations, but we can infer pride, ambition, belief that this time would be different. Or maybe desperation. Maybe Assyrian rule was so intolerable that even doomed rebellion seemed better than continued subjugation. But the cost wasn't paid by him alone. The entire population of Babylon suffered for his decision. Thousands died in the siege. Thousands more were executed or deported after the city fell. The city itself was devastated so thoroughly that it was nearly abandoned. For what? For one man's rebellion that was doomed from the start. This is the cruelest pattern, leaders who gamble with other people's lives. Mushezib-Marduk made his choice, to resist, to fight, to die if necessary. Noble, perhaps. But he made that choice for everyone in Babylon. They didn't get to vote. They didn't get to choose safer options. He decided for them that resistance was worth the price. And when the bill came due, it wasn't him who paid the most. It was the civilians who starved during the siege, who watched their children die of disease, who saw their city destroyed, who were marched into exile or executed in the aftermath. This is the responsibility that comes with power. Your decisions affect others. Your courage or pride or desperation becomes their suffering. And Mushezib-Marduk, like so many other Babylonian kings and rebel leaders, prioritized his own goals over their welfare. Sennacherib's son eventually rebuilt Babylon. The city was too important economically and symbolically to leave destroyed. But it was a different Babylon, broken and occupied, never fully recovering its former glory. The psychological trauma lasted generations. And Mushezib-Marduk, remembered as a patriot by some, a fool by others, a disaster by most. His 4-year reign accomplished nothing except destruction. His resistance achieved nothing except suffering. His legacy is a destroyed city and thousands of dead Babylonians. The pattern holds. Good intentions don't justify bad outcomes. Courage in the face of tyranny is admirable, but it doesn't absolve you of responsibility for the consequences. And sometimes, though we hate to admit it, submission might be less destructive than doomed resistance. That's an uncomfortable truth. But Babylon's ruins in 689 BCE testified to it. We touched on Shamash-shumukin earlier, but his story deserves deeper examination because it reveals how Babylonian kingship had become a trap by the 7th century BCE. Remember, he was Ashurbanipal's brother, installed as king of Babylon by their father Esarhaddon. On paper, he had authority. In reality, he was subordinate to his brother in Nineveh. And that contradiction, king in name, vassal in reality, poisoned everything. For 16 years, Shamash-shum-ukin played his role. He signed documents as King of Babylon. He performed religious ceremonies. He administered the city. But every significant decision required Assyrian approval. Every major appointment was vetted by Nineveh. He wore a crown, but it was a leash. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine being raised as a prince, trained to rule, given every advantage of royal education, and then being placed in a position where you're simultaneously king and servant, ruler and subject. The tablets from his reign show increasing frustration. Early inscriptions are deferential to Ashurbanipal, acknowledging his authority. Later inscriptions omit those acknowledgments. The language becomes more assertive, more independent. You can see him testing boundaries, asserting autonomy in small ways. And Ashurbanipal from Nineveh was watching. The correspondence between the brothers survives, clay tablets sent back and forth. Early letters are warm, brotherly. Later ones become tense. Ashurbanipal reminds Shamash-shum-ukin of his place. Shamash-shum-ukin protests that he's being undermined. The breaking point came in 652 BCE when Shamash-shum-ukin openly rebelled. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't a sudden decision. The tablets show he'd been planning for years, secretly building alliances, stockpiling resources, preparing for the inevitable conflict. This means he knew. He knew rebellion would lead to war. He knew war would devastate Babylon. He knew the likely outcome was his death and his city's destruction. And he did it anyway. Why? Pride, principle, desperation, all of the above. The sources don't give us his internal reasoning. But his actions suggest a man who decided that being a real king for a few years was worth dying for, even if it meant taking thousands of people down with him. The siege lasted from 650 to 648 BCE, 2 years. We've discussed it before, but let's sit with the human reality. 2 years of a city slowly starving, 2 years of watching your food supplies dwindle, 2 years of burying plague victims, 2 years of knowing relief isn't coming, that you're going to die here, and it's because your king chose pride over submission. The Babylonian chronicles describe conditions that are almost unreadable. People ate the flesh of their children. That's not metaphor. That's documentation of a siege so terrible that cannibalism became survival. And Shamash-shum-ukin, in his palace, also starving, also watching his city die, knowing he caused it. What was that like? To know that every corpse in the street, every starving child, every desperate act, they all trace back to your decision? When Babylon finally fell, Shamash-shum-ukin chose death over capture. According to Ashurbanipal's annals, he set his palace on fire and burned to death in the flames. Whether this was suicide, a final act of defiance, or an accident in the chaos of the city's fall is unclear. But the symbolism is stark. A king who chose to burn rather than submit, taking his palace down with him while his city burned around him. Was he brave or selfish? A freedom fighter or a fool? The answer probably depends on whether you were Shamash-shum-ukin, making the choice, or a Babylonian civilian dying because of it. Here's the pattern we need to recognize. The system was the problem. Esarhaddon thought he could solve succession issues by dividing his empire between his sons. But you can't be half independent. Either Shamash-shum-ukin was king of Babylon, or he was Ashurbanipal's subordinate. Trying to be both created an impossible situation that could only resolve through violence. And when that violence came, who paid? Not the brothers. They both had the dignity of dying for their choices. But the thousands of Babylonians who had no say in the decision, who were just trying to survive, who became collateral damage in a family dispute that escalated to total war. After the rebellion was crushed, Ashurbanipal had Shamash-shum-ukin's name systematically erased from monuments. Where his inscriptions appeared, they were chiseled away. Where his image was carved, it was defaced. The brother king was to be forgotten. But the trauma couldn't be erased. Babylon had been devastated twice in 60 years, first by Sennacherib, now by Ashurbanipal. The city's population was broken. Its economy was shattered, its pride was dust, and it would never fully recover. Shamash-shum-ukin chose his path. Ashurbanipal chose his response. And Babylon paid the price. That's the pattern. That's always the pattern. Leaders make choices, populations suffer consequences, and history remembers the leaders while forgetting the dead. After Shamash-shum-ukin's death, Babylon needed a king. Ashurbanipal installed someone named Kandalanu. And here's where it gets strange. We're not entirely sure Kandalanu actually existed. The historical record is bizarre. Kandalanu appears in Babylonian administrative tablets as king from 647 to 627 BCE, 20 years. But there are no royal inscriptions, no building projects, no military campaigns, no diplomatic correspondence, just administrative documents with his name and regnal years stamped on them. Some historians suggest Kandalanu was actually Ashurbanipal himself, ruling Babylon directly under a Babylonian throne name. Others think Kandalanu was a real person, probably a puppet so thoroughly controlled that he left no independent mark on history. Either way, this represents the ultimate degradation of Babylonian kingship, a king who either doesn't exist or might as well not exist. The tablets from this period show Babylonian administrations functioning, but it's mechanical. Taxes collected, grain distributed, temples maintained. But there's no personality, no royal initiative, no sense that anyone's actually in charge. It's government by bureaucracy, with the king as a rubber stamp. This is terror of a different kind, not dramatic violence, but systematic erasure. Babylon had a king, but the king was irrelevant. The city had autonomy, but the autonomy was meaningless. Everything functioned, but nothing mattered. For 20 years, Babylon existed in this strange limbo. Not quite independent, not quite occupied, not quite governed, not quite abandoned. The system ran itself while the throne sat empty, or occupied by a ghost, or a puppet, or Ashurbanipal wearing a Babylonian mask. What was this like for Babylonians? To have a king whose name you knew but face you'd never seen? To go through the motions of royal administration without any real royal presence? To maintain the fiction of kingship when everyone knew it was fiction? The psychological impact must have been profound. If kingship, the central organizing principle of their society, the institution that had defined Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years, could become this hollow, what did it mean? What were they serving? Who were they obeying? When Kandalanu Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, Babylon erupted in chaos. Multiple claimants fought for the throne. Civil war broke out. The system that had been maintained through ghostly routine collapsed the moment the ghost was gone. And here's the dark lesson. Empty authority is worse than no authority. At least tyrants give you something to resist. At least real kings can be held accountable. But how do you resist a phantom? How do you hold accountable someone who might not exist? Kandalanu's reign, if it was a reign, represents the final collapse of Babylonian kingship's legitimacy. After him came Nabopolassar, who founded the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. But that was starting over, building something new from the ruins of what kingship had become. The 20 years of Kandalanu were Babylon learning that titles without substance are prisons without walls. You're not free, but you can't even see what's confining you. You're ruled, but you can't identify the ruler. It's oppression as absence, terror as emptiness. Maybe that's the most disturbing form of power. When it becomes so complete, it doesn't need to show itself anymore. Just names on tablets, just bureaucracy running on momentum, just people going through motions, serving a system that serves nothing, answering to an authority that might not even be there. We've discussed Nabonidus before, but we need to return to him as the penultimate case because he represents the culmination of everything wrong with Babylonian kingship. Every pattern we've tracked, the cruelty, the incompetence, the religious manipulation, the disconnect from reality, all of it crystallized in his 17-year reign. Nabonidus came to power in 556 BCE through a coup. He had no legitimate claim to the throne. He was a courtier who seized power during a succession crisis. Already, we're starting with violence and illegitimacy. His obsession with the moon god Sin wasn't just religious eccentricity, it was political calculation. By elevating Sin, he was attacking the Marduk priesthood, Babylon's most powerful institution. But he miscalculated catastrophically. Instead of breaking their power, he united them against him. The verse account of Nabonidus, written by these priests, paints him as a madman who blasphemed against Marduk. But even accounting for bias, the picture that emerges is disturbing. Nabonidus canceled religious festivals, diverted temple resources, and appointed his own daughter as high priestess in a distant city, effectively creating a counter-religious center to undermine Babylon's traditional priesthood. Then he left. For a decade, he lived in Taima, an Arabian oasis 800 miles from Babylon, while his son Belshazzar ruled as regent. The Nabonidus Chronicle documents this absence with bureaucratic bewilderment. The New Year's festival, the most important religious ceremony in Babylonian calendar, couldn't be performed because it required the king's presence. For 10 years, it didn't happen. Think about what this means. The ritual that renewed the cosmos, that reaffirmed Marduk's kingship over the gods, that legitimized earthly kingship, canceled because the king was elsewhere worshiping a different god. The psychological impact on Babylonians must have been devastating. Their religious calendar was broken. Their most important festival didn't happen. Their king had abandoned them. What did this say about their relationship with the gods? Were they cursed? Had Marduk abandoned them too? Meanwhile, Nabonidus was in Taima, building temples to Sin, conducting excavations of ancient ruins, obsessing over long-dead kings. He wasn't neglecting Babylon. He'd moved on from it. He'd found something he cared about more. The administrative tablets from this period show Babylon deteriorating. Trade declined. Infrastructure wasn't maintained. The military was underfunded. And when Persian power began rising under Cyrus, Nabonidus barely noticed until it was too late. When he finally returned to Babylon in 539 BCE, after a decade away, it was too late. Cyrus had already maneuvered diplomatically, building alliances with Babylon's subject peoples, and gaining the support of Babylon's priesthood. The Marduk priests, whom Nabonidus had alienated, actively welcomed the Persian conquest. The city fell without a fight. Cyrus's forces entered through the dried riverbed of the Euphrates. The walls that Nebuchadnezzar II had built to be impenetrable were bypassed through engineering and treachery, and Nabonidus, captured and exiled. Given a comfortable retirement in Persia, he lived out his days far from Babylon, probably still obsessed with his religious studies, completely disconnected from the empire he'd lost. But the real tragedy isn't Nabonidus. It's what he represented. He was the culmination of 1,000 years of Babylonian kingship, and that culmination was a religious fanatic who abandoned his capital to pursue personal obsessions while his empire collapsed. Every pattern we've tracked led here: the concentration of power in one person, the lack of accountability, the ability of a single individual's failures to destroy an entire civilization. Hammurabi's tyranny, Nebuchadnezzar's cruelty, the ghost kings and puppet rulers, they all pointed toward this. A king so disconnected from reality that he let his empire die while he dug up old temples in the desert. Nabonidus didn't just lose Babylon, he proved that the system was irredeemably broken. You could have the title, the palace, all the apparatus of kingship, and still be so incompetent, so self-absorbed, so disconnected that your empire would fall apart around you. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe it's appropriate that Babylon's last independent king was a failure, because it showed that the system itself, not just the individuals within it, was the problem. The great experiment of Mesopotamian kingship, which had started with Hammurabi's law code and reached its peak with Nebuchadnezzar's monuments, ended with Nabonidus wandering in the desert while Babylon was conquered without a fight. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not with glory, but with absence. Not with a heroic last stand, but with a king who wasn't even there. We've already discussed Nebuchadnezzar III and Saru, the pretenders who claimed royal legitimacy decades after Babylon fell. But they deserve a final, collective examination because they represent the ultimate pattern. Even after the kings were dead, even after the empire was gone, the shadow of Babylonian kingship continued to kill. Between 522 and 484 BCE, multiple pretenders claimed the throne of Babylon. They'd rise up, declare themselves king, rally support, and then be crushed by Persian forces. Each rebellion lasted months at most. Each ended in execution and mass reprisal. Each accomplished nothing except more death. Why did people keep following them? Why did Babylonians repeatedly rally to obvious pretenders, knowing the likely outcome was defeat and punishment? The answer is complex, but it boils down to this. People would rather believe a comforting lie than accept an uncomfortable truth. The truth was that Babylon's independence was gone forever, that the age of Babylonian empire was over, that they were now subjects of Persia and would remain so. The lie was that the right king, the next Nebuchadnezzar, could restore what was lost. One more rebellion, one more claim to legitimacy, one more grasp at the shadow of former glory. And so, people died for a ghost. They died for the memory of an empire that had oppressed them, for kings who had exploited them, for a system that had ground them down for centuries. They died because the myth of Babylonian kingship was more compelling than the reality of Persian rule. This is the final, darkest pattern. The idea of kingship was more destructive than any individual king. Even after all the tyrants were dead, the concept itself continued to kill. People who could have lived peaceful lives under Persian administration instead chose death in doomed rebellions, because the narrative of Babylonian greatness was too powerful to resist. Think about what this means. We've documented 30 kings across 1,100 years. We've shown systematic cruelty, exploitation, terror. And yet, when given the choice between life under foreign rule and death fighting for a restored Babylonian kingdom, thousands chose death. Were they brave, foolish, indoctrinated, desperate, all of the above? The tablets don't record their motivations, just their deaths. After 484 BCE, after Xerxes crushed the final rebellions and melted down Marduk's statue, it finally ended. No more pretenders, no more rebellions. The myth was broken at last, but it took removing the god himself, physically destroying the statue that had embodied Marduk for 1,000 years, to finally kill the dream. It took cultural annihilation on a scale that made Nebuchadnezzar's cultural genocides look minor. It took Xerxes doing to Babylon what Babylon had done to so many others, erasing identity, destroying symbols, making the past irretrievable. And maybe that's the most chilling realization. You can't break these patterns gently. They don't respond to reform or reason. They persist until they're destroyed so thoroughly that they can't regenerate. The pattern of Babylonian kingship required complete destruction of Babylonian identity to finally end. What does that say about power, about how these systems embed themselves in culture, about how deeply they root in human psychology? It says they're parasites. They burrow into collective identity, into cultural narratives, into how people understand themselves and their place in the world. And once embedded, they're almost impossible to remove without killing the host. Babylon survived as a city for centuries after independence ended, but Babylon as a concept, as a kingdom, as a power, as a center of empire that died between 539 and 484 BCE. It died slowly, painfully, taking thousands of people with it, each one believing they could resurrect what was already buried. The pretenders were the death throes, the final spasms of a system trying to survive after its body was dead. And like all death throes, they were violent, pointless, and sad. We've journeyed through the 1,100 years of Babylonian history, examining 30 kings and the system they sustained. We've seen patterns of violence, exploitation, and cultural destruction repeat with depressing consistency. We've watched empire rise and fall, but the fundamental dynamics remained. So, what do we take from this? What lessons does Babylon offer? First, the obvious one. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Every Babylonian king, regardless of their initial intentions, ended up using violence to maintain control. The system demanded it. You either participated in the terror, or you were its victim. Second, monuments are not accomplishments. The Hanging Gardens, the Ishtar Gate, the walls of Babylon, they're beautiful. They're impressive. They're also built on mass suffering. Beauty doesn't redeem brutality. Architectural achievement doesn't justify human cost. Third, historical amnesia is dangerous. We remember Babylon's glory and forget its terror. We admire Nebuchadnezzar's building projects and forget his cultural genocides. We study Hammurabi's code and forget the mutilations it mandated. This selective memory allows the pattern to continue. We can't break what we refuse to see. Fourth, the pattern is systematic, not individual. The problem wasn't that certain kings were cruel. The problem was that the system rewarded cruelty and punished mercy. You can't fix systematic problems by swapping out individuals. You have to change the system itself. A fifth, victims rarely get their stories told. We know the names of kings. We have their inscriptions, their monuments, their version of history. The enslaved, the tortured, the culturally erased, they're mostly anonymous. Their suffering is reduced to statistics when it's acknowledged at all. And finally, the pattern persists. This isn't ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. This is a blueprint that's still being followed, a system that's still operating, a dynamic that still structures power relations today.